What is going on, you guys? Missed the part here, back again with a brand new series where I dive deep into fan fiction scenarios and break down a certain event in the timeline and see what possible outcomes it could lead to. For the launch of this series, I thought let's do a throwback to one of the original fan fictions on this channel. If Norman Osborn survived the final battle in Spider-Man 2002, you already know the outcome to one of the branched realities, but let's break it down and do 4 possible scenarios of Norman Osborn staying alive in this trilogy. This poses the question of so many outcomes, but I'm going to be going with the most realistic outcomes for these branched realities in Act 3 of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. Before we explore the multiverse and the Spider-Verse, do make sure to subscribe and request your fan fictions in the comments down below. I do take requests, and the one with the most upvotes will be the next fan fiction.
Give me your hand. Believe in me, as I believed in you. I've been like a father to you. Be a son to me now.
In the original Spider-Man 2002 timeline, it was near impossible for Norman Osborn to get out of the warehouse and succeed in his plan. He did get lucky near half of the battle, but at the end of the battle, he came up short using his glider to try and kill Peter Parker. This was impossible because of a few reasons. He lacked the strength to defeat Spider-Man, and the other reason is that Norman didn't really stand a chance against Spider-Man's spider sense, which gave Peter the advantage and killed Norman. So it was at this moment where they had that standoff where Norman Osborn's outcome of the winning became about 50% to 0%. He was defeated, and that one last ditch effort was the nail in the coffin for Norman Osborn, which led to all of the original Spider-Man events with Doc Ock, Harry Osborn, and even Venom. Let's say Norman Osborn, after all odds, somehow, some way, he didn't end up coming up short in the last stand. In this alternate reality, Norman Osborn uses the glider to his advantage and jumps out of the way using the rest of his strength to defeat Spider-Man. Spider-Man turns around at the last minute only to be sent flying into a wall, being impaled by Norman's glider, defeating Peter Parker. Events change very quickly in this timeline. Peter Parker would be dead, and Norman Osborn would be roaming free, becoming so happy that he killed the wall crawler for good. In this branched reality, Norman walks up to Peter, slowly fading away as blood is spilling from his mouth. In his eyes, he can see Norman just walking away as his own life slips away, knowing that he failed and that he wasn't the hero he could have been. Peter's face drops on the glider, slamming into it, and he takes his final breath, dying. Spider-Man is officially dead, and the most logical way this timeline plays out is that Norman Osborn rips the glider off of a dead Peter Parker, taking the body to the Daily Bugle, hovering over it. Norman's plan had succeeded, and he still would run Oscorp as usual. Oscorp would become a bigger company, and Norman would go back to the way he was because over time, he would see that there was no point in being the Green Goblin. Norman Osborn could still use the Green Goblin as a symbol of fear and power, getting anything he wanted and threatening people like J. Jonah Jameson. The Daily Bugle would print out papers saying Spider-Man no more, and papers like Spider-Man identity revealed. Most likely, he needed to take out people close to Peter Parker, like Mary Jane and even his own son, Harry Osborn. He knew that if there was any traces of him leading to being the Green Goblin, it could be the end of his reputation and the company, so things had to be kept under secret. Norman would spare Peter Parker's Aunt May, trying to look like the good guy by paying for the funeral. Otto Octavius would be hired by Norman Osborn, and since he wasn't dead in this timeline, the company wouldn't go through a transfer with Harry Osborn, so there wouldn't be a power shift within the company. Things were more organized and most likely wouldn't have failed. The renewable energy project most likely would have succeeded because Norman would have been able to fund it with some of the best scientists. Over time in this timeline, Harry opened the secret door and he would see the Goblin suit, glider, and equipment. Harry would become Hobgoblin, being angered of not getting his father's approval, but the tipping point would be when he learned that his father killed his best friend. Harry Osborn's butler Bernard would expose the secrets that Norman was hiding, and at this point Norman wanted to finish everybody off, clearing everyone that Peter Parker knew. He targeted Mary Jane, and since Peter is eliminated in this alternate timeline, Harry Osborn and Mary Jane would get back together, and Harry would become Hobgoblin, and he would be plotting for a way to take over his father's company and killing him, taking revenge for Peter Parker. Norman would try to kill Mary Jane, but Harry Osborn would stop this, leading into a city fight. It was good versus evil once again. Norman, being the most experienced fighter, takes the upper hand, jumping off of his glider in midair, doing a front flip, and the goblin knives impaled Harry Osborn, killing him. Harry would try being the next hero, but as Spider-Man, he would also fail. Norman Osborn could kill Mary Jane in this timeline, and he would break her neck after the fight with Harry Osborn. Norman could use his son's death as a cover-up, hiring people to cover his son's death up and leave no trail for the Green Goblin, being the convicted killer. The city eventually would become corrupted, and Norman Osborn, just like the Kingpin, ruling with an iron fist. The timeline can go two different ways. The first way is a darker take where Norman Osborn just rules as the Green Goblin before somebody exposes him, and that could even be his butler Bernard that tries to expose him but fails. Or another take on this timeline, Miles Morales becomes bit by the exact same spider from the field trip, becoming the next Spider-Man, eventually defeating Norman Osborn and swifting the city's power back to the people, officially destroying Oscorp. This most likely could lead to Miles getting the symbiote and fighting Doc Ock, as he would be the next villain in line to face him. Norman needed to die to make Peter become a stronger hero and learn his true power that he possessed within himself. He didn't want to kill Norman Osborn, but he had no choice, dodging the glider to save himself and Mary Jane. This created everything from Harry Osborn's revenge to the rise of Dr. Octopus in the second movie. During the standoff where Norman gives his hand begging for help, Peter doesn't take it and leaves Norman broken. There was a chance at this point for Peter to either take his hand and knock him out cold, or just knock him out, finishing the job once and for all, but it would be too late, and the events were already in place, and the glider either way would have shot in the air behind him. But what if this didn't happen? The second scenario can be run in many different ways. Peter knocks Green Goblin out before Norman calls for his glider, or the most realistic scenario, Peter senses the glider and in time uses his webs to pull Norman out of the way in time. We are going to be going with option 2. Peter front flips, hearing the glider shoot into the distance, and in this timeline, he uses his webs in midair to catch Norman Osborn. The glider blades would shoot into the wall, stabbing into it. Norman sees this happening, and he looks up to see Spider-Man. Spider-Man punches Norman in the face, and Peter webs him up. This would change the entire timeline, because now Peter and Norman know each other's secret, and this timeline plays out almost like the original Amazing Spider-Man comics, where they both know each other's names and identity, but they don't tell each other. Because Peter cares for his friend Harry Osborn, he would web Norman up, trying to tie his hands up. He would web him up, and Peter would pick up his body, leaving him for Harry Osborn. There wouldn't be a funeral for Norman Osborn, so now Harry doesn't have a grudge against Spider-Man, and Peter in this new timeline could be more secure with his identity, knowing that Norman still knows who he is. Norman Osborn gives up being the Green Goblin to run his company, and Harry Osborn most likely would go to college with Peter Parker, almost like the new animated series TV show. Norman Osborn would have memory loss like the original comic books, forgetting Peter as Spider-Man. This needs to happen to complete the Spider-Man 2 story. Norman wouldn't be able to corrupt the company and rule the city like our first scenario, because he has PTSD with Spider-Man and losing the battle. He could remember parts of the fight, but things were starting to go blurry. He would get projects done like Otto's renewable energy source, and Peter would still find a way to meet Otto Octavius and go to the demonstration as Spider-Man. He would go to the demonstration and he would save Norman Osborn and not Harry Osborn. Spider-Man and Doc Ock would still fight it out, and Otto would demand, telling Norman Osborn that he wanted the tritium, and this time they would make the deal. Harry Osborn and Mary Jane would be held hostage as prisoners for Otto, so he could gain leverage on Norman Osborn to get the tritium. Mary Jane most likely would go back with Harry in this timeline, making Peter jealous and sad, knowing that he was the one that could have had the girl, but with Norman Osborn and now Otto Octavius, he wouldn't be able to go with Mary Jane because it was too big of a risk. Doc Ock and Spider-Man would fight on the train, and Doc Ock would bring Spider-Man back to the Osborn residence house. Otto would take the tritium from Norman, leaving. Norman could do two different things here in this alternate timeline: kill Spider-Man for his defeat in the first film, or allowing him to live, figuring out his identity once again. Norman removes the mask to learn once again that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. Peter broke Norman's wrist fist and he would kick him to the ground, demanding to know where Otto Octavius was. Since Norman Osborn gave up being the Green Goblin, he wouldn't use the Goblin's serum and his body would be restored into a regular person. Peter yelled at Norman, demanding to know where Mary Jane and Harry Osborn were. He said, "Enough games, Norman," and in this timeline, he still loved his son, and after hearing this, he needed to help Spider-Man try to fight Otto Octavius and get his son back. He would reveal where Otto was working, and Spider-Man picked his mask back up, leaving. Norman would cry, knowing that Peter was Spider-Man and how he lost to him once again. Norman Osborn would become the Green Goblin once again in Spider-Man 3, and Spider-Man would reveal his identity to Mary Jane and Harry after saving them and defeating Doc Ock. Doc Ock wouldn't die in the final act, but he would be defeated pretty bad. He would go to jail, and Spider-Man would find a new value in being a hero after his friends found out that he was Spider-Man. He wouldn't tell them that Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin because he didn't want to hurt Harry. This timeline would shift because Norman Osborn remembers everything that happened to him. He would become the main villain in the third movie, and Spider-Man would still have the symbiote. Norman Osborn and Spider-Man would fight it out, and Spider-Man would almost turn into Venom, defeating Norman at the start of the film. The events of Spider-Man 3 wouldn't change too much because Flint Marko and Eddie Brock would still be in the mix of things. Peter slowly became consumed by the symbiote, ripping it off, and it would still find its way to Eddie Brock. Learning the truth behind Spider-Man, he would visit the Osborn residence house, and since Norman thought Venom was Spider-Man, there would be a massive fight, but Venom would win. He sided with Green Goblin, and Green Goblin would almost become the leader after being recruited. Green Goblin would break out Otto Octavius in jail, and it would almost be like the Sinister Six, but it would be the Sinister Four: Venom, Sandman, Otto Octavius, and Green Goblin. We can branch these timelines into two new alternate paths. The villains win against Spider-Man, or Spider-Man wins teaming up with Sandman, convincing him to help him defeat the rest of them. I would go with option 2, having Spider-Man and Sandman defeat Venom, Doc Ock, and Green Goblin. Spider-Man would use a pumpkin bomb from Green Goblin's glider, killing Venom, and Spider-Man would have his rematch, going one-on-one with him at the construction site. Spider-Man kicked Norman back, and he would fall to the ground onto a pole, being defeated. Spider-Man would rush in, and they would have their hands locked up. Norman laughed, trying to kill Spider-Man for one last time, and he had a pumpkin bomb in his hand, but it would fail, and he would be kicked in the gut and sent flying back with the bomb in his hand, and it would go off, killing Norman Osborn. Harry learned the truth about this, knowing that Peter killed his father, and he would become the Hobgoblin in the 4th film. After all that, I think at the very end, Norman somehow would still die, or at least become so tired that he can't physically keep up with Sandman and Spider-Man would also forgive Sandman, and Eddie and Otto would be thrown in jail, and the symbiote would die in this alternate timeline. Green Goblin breaking Spider-Man and destroying his spirit was a very, very possible thing near the end of the film. Norman had the opportunity to take everything away from Peter by testing him. He wanted to see if he would fail as a hero, and for this test, he would become a full hero by saving the children and the love of his life. Norman Osborn failed to see that he could have broken Spider-Man right then and there by snapping Mary Jane's neck and throwing her body down into the water. He didn't do this because he knew that he needed to test him and see if Peter would succeed, because he wanted to put the blame on him just in case he did fail. Then only then Spider-Man was to blame for either the kids dying or Mary Jane. Let's say things play out the same, but in this new scenario, Norman Osborn can see the flaw in his own test. He wants to see how far Spider-Man will go and see where his loyalty really lies, with his selfish needs to get the girl Mary Jane or to save the people of New York. Norman sees that this plan just won't work because he wants to have full power, becoming Peter Parker's mortal enemy. By doing this, he assumes the best way to break a hero's spirit and take away their power and everything they love. He knows what he stands for, and in this new timeline, Norman looks at Mary Jane as her shoes fall below. He laughs as he squeezes his hand on her neck. She begs for help, but an echo of a snap could be heard, and the kids started to cry. Spider-Man couldn't even believe this, and he would be completely broken. Norman Osborn crushed her neck, killing her. He tossed her over the bridge, and Spider-Man screamed, crying as he grabbed her body and the children. Norman Osborn saw this as an opportunity to escape, leaving Peter to drown in his own guilt and sorrow. The new timeline would be forever changed now because Peter still doesn't know who the Green Goblin is because of the ending scene when he beats the life out of Norman Osborn. Norman Osborn would quickly get on his glider, leaving, and Spider-Man would be holding the dead body of Mary Jane. The end of Spider-Man 2 2002 would be very different because in this timeline, Peter has now lost Uncle Ben and now Mary Jane. Harry Osborn would also be mad at this because he assumes Spider-Man killed Mary Jane and that he failed to save her from the Green Goblin. There would be no final scene at the end of this timeline, but there would be another scene. Spider-Man would be swinging in, murdering criminals in an alleyway, choking them to death at night and beating them to death. He realizes that Green Goblin was right all along and that the city was going to turn on him, and they would turn on him. Spider-Man failed to save Mary Jane. Everyone would turn on Spider-Man and he would be broken. Peter's soul couldn't be repaired and it would be beyond damage. He would give up being Spider-Man and Harry Osborn would work for his dad, being a co-owner of Oscorp. Norman tried keeping to himself, more distant from Peter and Harry after he killed Mary Jane, because he still wanted to run the company and also do more Oscorp projects. Since Peter is broken, he didn't know how to come back, but Aunt May would ask Peter where Spider-Man was and how he was going to get another job after leaving the Daily Bugle. Otto Octavius and Norman Osborn would still have their experiments with the Energy Project, and it would blow up, actually killing Otto Octavius in this timeline, because in the original timeline, Peter was the one just in time to stop the machine, but since he's not there, he wouldn't have been able to stop it. The explosion would be a lot worse, and Otto was electrocuted to death, and Norman's company would be all over the news and the Daily Bugle. The Daily Bugle printed papers out saying Norman Osborn responsible for Otto Octavius's death. Norman couldn't stand the news, and he thought he needed to get rid of J. Jonah Jameson before he starts trashing him and his company, because he would lose a lot of money and most people wouldn't want to invest in the company if they found out more about the project and why the project failed, and this would be all over the news because Spider-Man's no more, so Spider-Man isn't getting any more publicity within the city. Green Goblin would break into the Daily Bugle. As this was happening, Peter wanted to find work at the Daily Bugle, trying to regroup and fix his life back together. He knew that he needed another job somewhere, and as he walked on the streets of New York City, Green Goblin would be flying in the city. Peter would run into an alleyway and fight the Green Goblin in the Daily Bugle, and he would defeat him once again. Green Goblin would try to escape, but Spider-Man jumped out of the building following him. He would swing fast and far, seeing a trail of smoke. He would find the Green Goblin going to the Osborn residence house, and Peter would fight him there, learning the truth about Norman Osborn. They would fight in the house, and Peter would kick him in the gut, finishing the job off. Norman begged for mercy, and Harry Osborn ran to hear talking behind a wall. He would find it, and he would open the door to see his father was the Green Goblin. Spider-Man would leave Norman broken, and Harry would cry running out of the house. Spider-Man started swinging, and Harry wouldn't even be able to believe it in this timeline. Spider-Man 3 would go very different because Harry would have his father in prison, and Spider-Man would become a killer. Harry took over the Green Goblin mantle, becoming the Hobgoblin, seeking revenge on Spider-Man. He still blamed Spider-Man for killing Mary Jane, but he also blamed his father. Peter bonded with the symbiote, and in this timeline, he would become Venom, killing criminals. Hobgoblin and Sandman would team up in the final act of Spider-Man 3, but the symbiote consumed Spider-Man would win, not being able to unbond with the symbiote, and he would become fully evil at the end of the film. Norman Osborn would laugh in jail, knowing that he turned New York City's greatest hero into New York City's worst villain. The final act of the film was the breaking point for Norman Osborn. He was cornered, and like the first two scenarios, it would have been a real miracle for him to survive when he shot his glider out to Spider-Man. There was no possible way he could have cheated death in the final act because Peter found out who he was, and he was broken and beaten in the corner. I feel like there could have been one way he could have cheated death, and that way could have been him using a lot of his technology. We don't really see Norman Osborn use a lot of his tech, but this is the only way he could have survived and cheated death, running away and escaping to fight another day. In this alternate reality, Spider-Man had Norman backed in a corner like the original Spider-Man 2002 timeline, but this time something would change. Norman had a pumpkin bomb with him. He was beaten and he had the bomb in his left hand. He wouldn't tell Spider-Man to stop because of how badly he was getting beaten, so in this timeline he didn't have the ability to call for his glider, and Spider-Man pinned Norman to a wall, beating him, and he started crushing his hands. He looked to see the Green Goblin drop the pumpkin bomb, and Spider-Man looked in shock as it was blown up. Green Goblin and Spider-Man fell down towards the warehouse, and parts of it crushed Peter and Norman Osborn. Peter Parker would break free, looking around to see nobody in sight. He screamed for Green Goblin and looked around. Green Goblin would escape, coming home to see Harry Osborn. He threw his Green Goblin mask on the ground, exhausted. In this new timeline, Harry didn't know what to do, and he yelled at his dad. His father knew that he's been exposed as the Green Goblin. Harry would have flashbacks of all involved the events with Norman Osborn when he threw a pumpkin bomb at the expo, laughing at him when he was dying. He knew he had to do something, and Harry would try running out of the way, but Norman would throw a pumpkin bomb, laughing, killing Harry Osborn. Harry went missing in this timeline, and since Peter Parker doesn't know who Green Goblin is, Peter went to the Osborn residence house to see if Norman was alright. It was a trap for Peter, and when he walked into the house, he would be caught off guard to see a glider shoot into the air, but he would dodge the attack. Peter became shocked seeing that Norman was the Green Goblin, and they would fight in the house. Spider-Man defeated Norman Osborn, and the company was taken over by Quest Aerospace, because now there can't be a transfer to Harry since he's dead, and Otto wouldn't be able to work for Oscorp since it would have been shut down and taken over. Norman still knew Peter's identity and jail, but would still keep it, and he would also suffer from memory loss, only remembering the fight between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. There would be a funeral for Harry Osborn, and Peter in this timeline revealed to Mary Jane at the funeral that he was Spider-Man, explaining why they couldn't be together. Spider-Man still would lose his powers, and Norman Osborn would break out of prison, getting a brand new Hobgoblin suit. Over time, he would figure out his identity, and Hobgoblin went to the Daily Bugle, showing J. Jonah Jameson and Eddie Brock proof that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. It was all over the news, and Peter would be exposed, but he wouldn't come out of the shadows because he's already given up being Spider-Man. Mary Jane and Aunt May would figure it all out, and Peter would try to return as Spider-Man, and they would tell him to return, and he would. Spider-Man and Hobgoblin fought within the city, and Peter would defeat him again. They would throw him in jail, and the world would learn that Peter was Spider-Man. The events of Spider-Man 3 wouldn't happen, but Peter still would get the symbiote trying to remove it, and he would. The symbiote wouldn't go on to Eddie Brock since he knows Peter is already Spider-Man. It would die, not bonding with anyone. And Peter would take some of Norman's tech, creating the Mark I suit. In this alternate Spider-Man 4, Spider-Man would have the Mark I suit, and he would go up against the Sinister Six. Norman Osborn would be leading the battle, and it would have Mysterio, Shocker, Sandman, and even Vulture. Sandman would join Norman, and they would try to defeat him, but like our original scenario, Sandman betrays Norman Osborn, siding with Peter, defeating the villains. Peter would forgive Flint Marko for killing his Uncle Ben, and Peter would date and end up marrying Mary Jane in this timeline. I feel like this timeline is one of the most realistic scenarios because Norman Osborn, if he ended up cheating death, he would have been tormenting Peter so much to the point where his identity would have been revealed somehow publicly to the Daily Bugle, and I still think even if it happened, it would have turned out kind of like the 1994 Spider-Man Mark I universe, and I do believe that Otto would have been sidelined in this alternate timeline since Quest Aerospace did end up taking over Oscorp, so a lot of those events in Spider-Man 2 and 3 would be completely different. So let me know in the comments down below what your favorite timeline was, and which one did you pick, and which one did you like. But anyways, as always, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn your notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always guys, I do want to be more active on YouTube. This video really took a long time to make. This took over 3 days to make and create. It's an official new series on the channel, so if you guys want to see more scenarios where I break down different scenarios in different timelines, do make sure to let me know if you guys want this, because I don't know if you guys even want it or not. I have to bring something new to the table, so I thought, why not do this? But anyways, as always,
throughout the multiverse is trying to destroy all of space and time.
What if Spider-Man the Animated Series? What if events went differently? What if Madam Web chose a different group of Spider-Men to defeat Spider-Carnage? Coming soon in animation format.
By using a special power from my chair. He poses no harm to any of you.
Wow, thanks lady, because I thought I was lunch. Sorry, my bad. Out of my way, Spider-Man. I'll do